What is up, social studies family? Welcome back to the vlog. Welcome back to social studies. Believe it or not, we are done with chapter 2. Today is just going to be a review of from the beginning of chapter 1 to the end of chapter 2, and it'll probably be really useful in the review that we'll have tomorrow. So, might want to pay attention or know that you can always come back and watch it again. Hint, hint. All right. So way back in the beginning of chapter 2, I'm going to be using my teacher book here to help me guide me through it because I cannot remember all of this. The same way you guys can use your social studies book if you want to again. But we're going to talk about a quick review. And way back when we started chapter 2, we started talking about the first peoples, or the very, very first people that lived in Indiana. And the way that we found out about these people is they didn't have the stories written down, or not even really survivors, because this is before even like the Miami nations and stuff like that. So the way we found out about all these cultures was through archaeologists. Archaeologists, remember, are scientists that study artifacts or objects from the earth and try to learn all they can from those objects from the earth about the cultures and the way that they lived. And some of the artifacts that they used to find were like arrowheads, tools, and it was mostly the hard things that left because all the soft things kind of wear away after thousands and thousands of years. So remember, way back then, some of the first people arrived almost 13,000 years ago. We think they came across from like Alaska on down to the west coast and moved across Indiana. A lot of them had to adapt to different climates as they went through it. So if you think about California, it can be hot. And as they moved this way, it got colder and thicker forests. And to do this, they kind of formed groups or culture groups. And being in a group helped them survive. And the culture group, they started to come up with their own traditions and way of doing things. So we talked about the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Mississippian. And these were some of the first cultures in Indiana. And one of the cool things is they all were kind of the same, but also were all different. They all had burial mounds or big, huge, let me show you a picture here. These big, huge mounds like this that they would bury either sometimes as cemeteries or where they would bury people, or sometimes just for religious purposes, and that's where they would bury them, or they even had their houses on top. So I'm just going to talk a few of the differences. Some of the similarities is they all built the mounds. Some of the differences are the Adena culture. They mostly did hunting. So all their food was from hunting, and they would tend to follow the game or the animals that they would hunt. And so they were almost exclusively hunting with just a little bit of farming or agriculture. The Hopewell, again, they built mounds just like the other ones, but they started to shift from only hunting to probably like a mix, 50-50. Some hunting and some farming. So in the summer times, they would farm. In the winter times, they would hunt and follow animals. And then the last is the Mississippian culture, and they were mostly agriculture, more agricultural than the other two. So they would like plant in the spring and summer and fall. They'd be getting a lot of their food. And just in the winters when they hunted, just that little bit. Where the Hopewell was like 50%, and then the Adena was mostly just hunting. And those are kind of just like the early, really brief. There's a lot more about them. But this is just the early info on the first peoples. After the first peoples, we learned about what we now call the Native Americans. And these were much more organized groups, and they were much larger than the first early peoples. And I gotta move. Look at all these stickies I made to help. If you ever like are reading a book and you can't remember it, I recommend stickies. Anyway, back on track, Mr. B. They had 4 tribes, or was it 5? I think it was 5. Nope, just 4 of the 5. No, it was 5. They had 4 of the bigger tribes that were in Indiana. We had the Miami clan, which we learned all about, and we got to even watch the video and not the interview, but the video before we learned about how they were a not represented nation. And the Miami had many different clans, and a clan is just a smaller little group within a big group. So sometimes we might have like a Mr. B, Miss Keller, Miss Donovan's class, and we're all one big class, but sometimes you might break into a small little reading group. So that's what a clan is. So they had clans, and they built things called wigwams, which was a house, and it was like rounded like a dome, and it was usually like covered in bark or fur. And they were some of the first people to adopt to the land of Indiana and stay put. Like they made like a town and they would stay put. We also had the Potawatomi. They came down from Michigan. They built these thing called longhouses. So instead of like a wigwam, which is like a one family house, they had long houses that would be 20, 30 feet. And they could house up to 7 different families in one house. Kind of cool. We had the Lenape. They came from the east because they were getting pushed out by the early settlers. So they came from the east. And we had the Shawnee. They were forced to move here from the east by other Native American groups. And the Shawnee, they had a lot of clans as well. And then the Kickapoo, they were the ones that resisted being taken over by other cultures because they wanted to keep their culture strong. And I think they were one of the first to actually start riding horses. Cool side fact. You guys then read about trade and how trade is good for both sides, because sometimes I might have something that you need and you might have something that I need. So if we trade those things, we both benefit from it. So trade is meant to benefit both people. So the Native Americans started trading not only with each other, but soon the Europeans started coming. So they started trading with the Europeans, which leads us to the Europeans coming. So the Europeans started coming. They started coming in the 1500s. And it first started off with the Spanish, then the French, and then the British. The Spanish were way down low, like Florida and like Cuba and those islands and stuff like that. The French were way up high in Canada. And the British were right where we would call New England. They came from England, New England. They came to like Boston, New York, Massachusetts. Plymouth Rock was where they first came. But that's where they started to settle. The first Europeans that tried to settle Indiana were the French. They claimed it as a territory. So remember, a territory is a new place that the people live, but they still are ruled by their old government from France. So even though they lived in America, they were still governed or ruled by the French. And the French lived here, and they were trappers and traders, but they trapped the fur a lot of the animals, and they would use them for hats and all sorts of hats and fur and meat to eat. And they would trade not only with the Native Americans, but they'd also trade with people on the East Coast or even all the way back to France. One of the conflicts that started to come up, before I go that, and the French, when they first moved here, it was really rough for them because, think about it, there was nothing, no roads, no maps, nothing. So a lot of time when they move around, they'd use waterways because it's a lot easier to move and paddle through water than to try to get like a horse through a thick, dense forest. And there was a lot of danger for them too. Not only animals, but sometimes Native Americans were not mean, and sometimes even other French people were not nice to each other. So the French started off here, and they were trading, and they made allies of some of the natives. An ally is just like a friend that you use, and they would trade with them a lot. And that's how like the French would like get. the Native Americans would get copper, and then the French could trade their furs for them. And you could even, when you would trade, you could even get all the way in Indiana. If you trade enough things with the different people and they keep trading it, you could get like a seashell all the way from Florida to Indiana just by trading with different people as they traveled around. But the French traded with the Native Americans. Soon the British started coming across from the east, and this was going to lead to conflict. You guys read about this. Conflict happens when two sides are kind of like arguing or fighting over the same thing. So the French and the Native Americans were trading really nice, and the British came and they had cheaper things. So the Native Americans were like, well, I don't want to trade with the French anymore because I can get more if I trade with the British. And this led the British and the French to not like each other. And so it kind of separated those two. And then the Native Americans kind of had to pick a side, and there was kind of a little bit of a war. And then eventually the French ended up losing the war because they ran out of money and supplies. Because it was a lot harder for them to come all the way around and down from Canada to get supplies when the British could just come from like Ohio and that way. So that was Mr. B talking really fast about a quick recap of chapter 2. Tomorrow you are going to take just do some questions about it. Mr. B's going to have a really short video for you guys to watch. I would watch it. You might get some tips on how to do really well on the questions. It's just a practice question, so like if you get one wrong, it's not the end of the world. We'll all be okay. But I really want you to try to find the answers. So watch the video tomorrow, maybe 2 minutes at most. It'll give you some tips and tricks on how to answer the questions to the best. Until then, this vlog is over, and I will see you later.